Joining me to discuss the continued wrestling match between the governor and legislature is Betsy Russell of the Idaho Press. Betsy, the legislature's frustration with the governor hasn't dissipated at all in the last few weeks.
Well, I mean, it's changed, I would say. Certainly this chess match, as Senator Vitt called it, is not over by any means, but we did see one round of it end. And that is that the governor, when he moved Idaho back to stage 3, to less restrictive restrictions having to do with COVID-19, he revoked the very public health order that all the legislators were trying to target. And so you saw resolutions get pulled back because they were trying to revoke it. He revoked it for them and instead put in place basically voluntary guidelines. Everything that's in place now as far as COVID-19 in Idaho from the state level is voluntary. It does not have enforcement. It doesn't have criminal penalties. Now, that may not be true of local ordinances, but the governor basically took a big step toward what the legislature was trying to accomplish, and so the legislature kind of changed its aims. Instead of now targeting the governor's emergency declarations, which were what raised the concerns about losing our federal funds, the very funding that's funding the Idaho National Guard call out, the rollout of the vaccine, they are now targeting all future public health orders and what kinds of restrictions can be imposed, and that we'll never again have any kind of order in Idaho that would say anyone's not essential or that would limit rights to gather. And so we're seeing lots now of legislation along those lines, including bills in both houses. There was yet another resolution introduced just today that attempts to void the 50-person gathering guideline that the governor issued for public and private gatherings because 2 legislators were very upset about an upcoming girls' basketball tournament. That actually isn't even affected by that 50-person guideline. It's a different thing, but you're right, feelings are still running high.
And these proposals from the legislature aren't happening in a vacuum. There are a lot of constituents in Idaho who are bringing these concerns to their lawmakers, but it's like we're having 2 different conversations here, right? One that is using metrics that are based on public health and hospitalizations, and one that is very concerned with things like the economy, the ability to gather, and the ability to make sure that businesses aren't closed. Are these 2 things always in conflict with each other? Is there a middle ground here that you've seen in any of these discussions?
Well, I think that when the governor made his change, he cited public health metrics. He said the reason he made his change was because we were seeing a decrease in cases and a decrease in hospitalizations, which in fact has been quite pronounced, particularly as far as our decline in new cases every day. From the legislature, we're hearing a very different story. What the legislative majority has been focused on is basically attempting to legislate away the pandemic completely and, quote, get back to normal. And we're hearing that repeatedly from Republican legislators, including House State Affairs Chairman Brent Crane today when he introduced this new legislation, this new resolution about gatherings, saying we've got to get back to normal, we've got to make it just like it always was. Now, of course, the pandemic isn't over, as other legislators have acknowledged, but there is certainly a drive among the majority in the legislature to try to legislate it away, to get things back to where they were when we didn't have a pandemic. And that raises issues about whether instead of making it go away, it might actually make it worse. Maybe spread will increase if we don't take public health measures, follow guidelines, as the governor has asked, in order to lower that risk. So yeah, there are definitely 2 different conversations going on. It's very easy to see who's on which side of the conversation because here in the State House, the majority of Republican legislators are not wearing masks. I've even seen some legislators who are new and who arrived at the beginning of the session wearing masks because, they are required right now in Ada County and Boise, although the legislature is exempt. And because there was a public health emergency, stop doing so, kind of, align with the cool kids who really don't care about the pandemic anymore. We've seen, of course, earlier Representative Heather Scott in the House announced that by her measure, the pandemic's over. For those who are still getting sick, it's not. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation. We are still seeing very few members of the public here at the Capitol.
And lobbyists and other reporters too. I know a
Right.
lot of them are staying away. Before we leave this week, I want to ask you about Medicaid funding and a big change to the governor's proposal this week in the Joint Finance Committee.
That's right. The Medicaid budget is incredibly complicated. And within the governor's recommendation, there was a proposal calling for $30 million in state general fund cost containment measures to be taken in next year so that the state wouldn't provide that $30 million in funding, and at the same time we would lose far more in federal matching funds to bring it to a total of $118 million less overall in funding for Medicaid. But the governor didn't propose a specific way to achieve that cost containment. And the administration did come to a Senate committee and say, why don't we just let the Department of Health and Welfare at its discretion cut reimbursements to providers when it needs to for savings? And the legislature said, no, that's not what we're going to do. They refused to even introduce the bill. So there's no way to accomplish that savings. So when the Medicaid budget came up for its hearing in JFAC this week, the governor's office withdrew that proposal, but not just because it couldn't get the legislation in, because there's been a change from the federal level. The federal matching rate for regular Medicaid has gone up significantly, meaning tens of millions of dollars more in federal funding for the state that the state doesn't have to cover in its Medicaid program because of the pandemic. And 2 weeks ago, the Biden administration announced that that increase in what's called the FMAP, the matching rate, is going to last for the entire calendar year. Well, that means that the state will get something like $27 million in the current budget year and something like $56 million in the next budget year that was not anticipated in the governor's budget. So the Health and Welfare Director, Dave Jepson, said the administration is no longer recommending that $30 million cut in state funds, and is instead recommending covering that with those savings from having the increased federal match, and also, because there will still be money left over, starting what they're calling a stabilization fund to hedge against future Medicaid cost increases, which have long been a concern.
Betsy, we have about half a minute left, but briefly, January revenue numbers came in stronger than expected.
That's right, and it's the 7th straight month that they have done that, $58 million more than anticipated. The state surplus just keeps building and building.
All right, Betsy Russell of the Idaho Press, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for watching. Again, we have much more online at our blog and social media. You'll find the links at idahoptv.org/Idaho Reports. We'll see you next week.